Hey there. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're traveling back in time, going to the Andes Mountains, a place I know you're curious about, to uncover the history of violence in the region. We've got some fascinating research to explore. It covers from about 470 AD to 1450 AD, but we'll peek a little before and after that too. Now I know, violence can be a heavy subject, but trust me, this deep dive uncovers some surprising insights. And to really get into it, it helps to think about the Andes in three zones: the highlands, the coastal regions, and the areas in between, what we'll call the mid-elevations. Each zone had its own thing going on. Each played a really unique role in this whole history of violence. So are you ready to explore how climate change, ancient societies, and even a few cracked skulls can help us understand the past?
Let's do it. Unpacking the story of violence in the Andes means looking beyond just the fighting itself. We're going to connect it to the environment, social structures, and even how different genders experience these periods. It's going to get really interesting.
Okay, let's jump right in with this study from UC Davis. It really sets the stage. They were looking at skeletal remains in the south central Andes, focusing on head injuries, as a potential indicator of violence. Makes sense, right? And what they discovered was super intriguing. Between 470 AD and 1500 AD, there was a noticeable increase in these head injuries, suggesting more violence, obviously. But, and here's the kicker, this trend was mostly found in the highland populations. The coastal and mid-elevation folks, not so much. That geographic difference feels significant, doesn't it? What are your thoughts on that?
It really is, and it's the so what that makes the study so insightful. See, the researchers point out that the coastal and mid-elevation areas were more diverse in their resources. They had fishing, agriculture at various altitudes, they had options, which likely made them more resilient to changes in climate. The highlands, on the other hand, well, they were much more vulnerable to droughts. And the study directly links those droughts to the increase in violence they saw in the bones.
Makes sense. When resources are scarce, people tend to get a little dot competitive, right?
Precisely. And get this, the way they connected those droughts to the actual violence is fascinating. They compared the skeletal records to ice core data from the Quilcaya Glacier.
Hold on, they used ice to study violence from centuries ago? That's incredible. How does that even work?
It's remarkable. Essentially, the ice acts as a historical record of precipitation. By analyzing the layers of ice, specifically the amount of annual ice accumulation, they could track rainfall patterns over time. And here's the kicker. They found that for every 10-centimeter decrease in annual ice accumulation, meaning less rain, the likelihood of violence more than doubled.
Wow, talk about a blast from the past, literally frozen in time. Okay, so we've got climate change, specifically droughts, potentially leading to more violence in the Andes highlands. And this next study, this one's from PLOS Climate, kind of hints at a potential pattern here. It covers 1993 to 2019, so way more recent. And it looked at the link between climate shocks and violence against women. And get this, in a whopping 156 countries. This wasn't just an Andes thing. It seems to be happening across the globe. Do you see any parallels here? I mean, even with that huge gap in time, it's kind of hard to ignore.
Absolutely. While the PLOS climate study focuses on intimate partner violence, which is a very specific and complex form of violence, the consistent thread is the link between climate shocks and increased violence. It seems that regardless of the location or the specific time period, environmental stress can amplify existing societal tensions. You know what I find particularly
That's
striking?
that.
The more recent study, the PLOS one, it emphasizes the need for more data on violence against women to truly understand the long-term impact of these climate shocks. And it highlights a significant limitation when studying violence in the past. We only have the skeletal remains. And as compelling as they are, they can't tell us the whole story.
But this is a really good point. It's like trying to understand an entire epic just by reading one chapter. There's a lot we might be missing.
Exactly. And this is where our next study adds a fascinating layer to the conversation.
This PLOS-1 study, this one really throws us a curveball. It examined hunter-gatherer societies on the Atacama Desert coast, spanning a massive 10,000 years. And get this, they found that violence rates remained pretty steady for millennia, even with the introduction of farming. That seems to contradict the idea that resource scarcity driven by climate change is the main driver of conflict. How do you reconcile that with what we've seen in the other studies?
It's definitely a head-scratcher at first glance. On the surface, it seems to contradict the idea of climate change and resource scarcity driving conflict, right? But remember, the Atacama study focuses on a specific region and time period one without a centralized political system. It's possible that in this context, violence was so ingrained in their social fabric that environmental factors had less of an impact.
So it was already a pressure cooker, so to speak,
Yeah.
and climate change didn't really change the temperature.
Precisely. Now, contrast that with the broader Andes, where the UC Davis study suggested that the introduction of agriculture might have actually disrupted existing power structures and sparked new competition for resources.
It's like someone tossed a match into an already volatile mix.
And that's where things get really messy. Imagine you're used to a certain way of life, and suddenly there's a new system with winners and losers when it comes to resources. The shift to agriculture wasn't just about new food, it was about power, control, and who got to call the shots.
And when those things are up for grabs, well, let's just say people don't always play nice. But this idea of turning scarcity into conflict, it's not just an ancient problem, is it?
Unfortunately not. It's a pattern we see throughout history, not just in the Andes. Think about the rise and fall of empires, the scramble for resources during periods of colonization. It often boils down to competition and control, especially when resources are perceived as limited.
It's almost like humanity has a knack for turning a shared problem into a fight, which, let's be honest, isn't exactly a recipe for a happy planet. So if we're seeing echoes of this throughout history, what does that mean for us today? We're facing some pretty daunting challenges, especially with climate change. Are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, destined to fight over dwindling resources?
That's the big question, isn't it? But I'm not convinced that we're locked into some predetermined path. These studies don't just highlight the problems, they offer valuable insights into potential solutions. By understanding the factors that contribute to violence, resource scarcity, social structures, and yes, climate change, we can start to develop strategies for mitigation and conflict resolution.
It's like that old saying, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it, or something like that.
I'm not sure if that's an actual adage, but it certainly makes sense. We don't have to be slaves to the patterns of the past.
Okay, maybe it's more of a personal mantra. Either way, your point stands. Knowing what we do about the past, what are some of the key takeaways that we can apply to the present? I mean, that's not like we can just magically make everyone get along, right?
Well, we can certainly try. But in all seriousness, I think one of the most important takeaways is the importance of cooperation. When resources are scarce, it's easy to fall into a scarcity mindset, where we view everything as a zero-sum game. But history shows us that collaboration, rather than competition, is often the key to resilience and long-term success.
So more kumbaya, less conflict.
Essentially, yes. But on a more practical level, I think these studies also highlight the importance of equitable resource distribution, sustainable practices, and proactive conflict resolution mechanisms. These are all complex issues, but by addressing them head-on, we can create a more peaceful and sustainable future.
That's a future I can definitely get behind. It sounds like we need to channel our inner diplomats, not our inner warriors. But, and maybe this is the pessimist in me, is it really possible to overcome thousands of years of, well, human nature?
That's where things get really interesting.
Oh boy, here we go. Don't leave me hanging. What's so interesting about it? You said interesting twice now. You got me. I'm hooked. What's so interesting about this idea that we could actually shift thousands of years of ingrained behavior?
Well, it's interesting to even ask that question, isn't it? The fact that we're reflecting on these patterns, wondering if we can overcome them. It suggests that maybe we're not just prisoners to our baser instincts, We have this capacity for self-awareness, and that's a powerful thing.
Okay, that's a good point. We can at least recognize when we're being a little greedy or when we're quick to jump into conflict mode.
Exactly. And, throughout history, there are tons of examples of societies finding peaceful, cooperative solutions to what seem like impossible conflicts, really. It's not easy. It takes work, a real effort to move away from that fear and scarcity, but it is possible.
So there's hope. Okay, I do like the sound of that. But let's be real. We're not going to snap our fingers and suddenly everyone's holding hands singing Kumbaya.
Of course not. But we can learn from the past, right? We can understand the ingredients that often lead to violence, and then make smarter decisions that promote peace and sustainability. The studies we've talked about today, they're like a roadmap showing us the potholes to avoid,
Yeah,
and highlighting the scenic routes we can take instead.
I like that, a roadmap.
Yeah.
But what does that look like for everyday folks like me? I mean, I try to be a good person, but I'm not out here negotiating peace treaties or anything. So what can I actually do with this knowledge?
You absolutely don't need to be a world leader to make a difference. Even small acts of cooperation, understanding, compassion, those can have a ripple effect. Supporting organizations working on conflict resolution, advocating for fair access to resources, even just being mindful of the language we use when we talk about these issues, it all matters.
It's about changing the conversation, right?
Mhm.
Changing the way we think about these things.
Precisely. Because the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, they matter. If we focus on division and scarcity, well, that's the reality we're more likely to create. But if we emphasize our shared humanity, our capacity for empathy and cooperation, well, that opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
It's like choosing to see the glass as half full, even when it feels like the well's about to run dry.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe by changing our perspective, we can start to refill that glass together.
Now, that's an ending worth thinking about. This has been quite a journey, this deep dive into the history of violence in the Andes. We've gone from cracked skulls to ice cores to, well, glimmers of hope for the future.
It's been fascinating to explore these connections with you.
And a huge thank you to you, dear listener, for joining us on this adventure through time and knowledge. As you go about your day, here's something to ponder. If climate change and resource scarcity have fueled conflict in the past, what can we do differently today to build a more peaceful and sustainable tomorrow? Keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.